For centuries, Australia's Aborigines lived off the land, self-sufficient and independent. But all that changed with the arrival of the European settlers. Today, many Indigenous communities are in crisis, racked by alcoholism, drug addiction and violence. Many lag behind the rest of society in areas like health, housing, education and jobs. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has promised to close that gap within one generation. I'm Fawzia Ibrahim. In this edition of 101 East, we ask, what is the future for Australia's Aborigines? In 2007, the Australian government declared a state of emergency here in the Northern Territory as part of efforts to combat alcoholism and child sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities. Since taking power in December of 2007, the Rudd government has continued with these policies. Chan Tao Cho reported on the intervention at the time. Now, 18 months later, he returns to see how these measures are affecting the lives of Indigenous people.
The intention is to introduce widespread alcohol restrictions on Northern Territory Aboriginal land. We're going to ban the possession of X-rated pornography in the prescribed areas.
We are losing our people, for goodness sake, and we are burying young people through alcohol. So that's what they asked the government. You know, government's got the power to stop it.
And so they tried. The Howard government's intervention was riddled with controversy. But Kevin Rudd continued with it after he was sworn in as Prime Minister in December 2007. Today, to ensure money is spent on essentials like food and not alcohol, half the welfare money for Aboriginal parents is credited into a card to be used only in certain stores. In Alice Springs, William Tilmouth is a fierce critic of the policy. He heads the Tangentyere Town Council, a service provider for the 18 Aboriginal town camps here.
Some people say that they have a lot of trouble in accessing their cards, their basic cards. They don't understand how the system works, and therefore it is a big disadvantage to them. And the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act allows this to happen. There is no justification for racism.
Instead of, whinging to the government all the time and accusing the government of being racist, why don't we take it on board ourselves and do something for ourselves?
Bess Nungarai Price grew up in Yuendumu, a remote community northwest of Alice Springs. As a young woman, she witnessed how alcohol-induced domestic violence took away the lives of her loved ones. She was also abused by her ex-husband, whom she left to marry this man in 1980. Since then, they've lived in Alice Springs but remain in regular contact with the community.
Aboriginal people's lifestyles, going down a spiral, and it's not good, and they're denying the young children to have a better future. And that's what, why I get so angry when people stand up and say, you're denying, Aboriginal people human rights. They're denying those kids, human rights as well.
18 months ago, just as the federal intervention started, 101 East visited a childcare centre in the remote Ikunji community. At the time, the coordinator said while there was no child sexual abuse, kids often witnessed drunken fights at home. Today, we are returning to the community, 250 kilometers west of Alice Springs, to see how the intervention has affected it. The new childcare supervisor, Mary Tallow, arrived 7 months ago.
I haven't heard kids come complain, oh, I don't get food yesterday because my mum and dad drunk. I haven't heard that.
Today, food is on the table because the quarantined half of the welfare money has been spent mostly in a local shop using the welfare card. Families have also seen improved security due to increased police presence in the community. Before the federal intervention, the nearest police station was 30 kilometers away. Rachel Burke has run the Ikunji Art Centre for the last 2 years. The artists she works with paint a different picture to her about domestic violence since the intervention.
Before a police presence here, yes, there was trouble. There was fighting. And, you know, a lot of the times it was alcohol driven. So now with the police presence here, the problems don't get a chance to escalate.
But some of the elders in the community resent being under the government's microscope.
We feel like someone's watching over us, putting a fence over us. We have no control of our lives, you know. This is free country, but we're not free. Everybody drinks. White people, yellow people, blue people, green people. Why can't we have drink, decent drink?
And Aboriginal people haven't helped themselves. You know, the government's been there, you know, pushing, funding, all sorts of training, all sorts of, you know, areas where our people could have been empowered now, but they never have taken that opportunity on.
When you've got Aboriginal people who are demoralised and dispossessed to the nth degree that they become nothing, how can you redeem and close that gap? You need to restore the dignity and the humanity in people. It's about getting on the ground and working with people with people in situ. Under trees, if they live under trees, so be it. You have to be there.
In the town camps in Alice Springs, residents say government officials have not been there to explain their plans. The issue of housing is one of the main areas of concern among the Aboriginal community in town camps like this. Now, the Australian government wants to lease the land for 40 years to improve the living conditions, but there is genuine fear among the people that the authorities may let them down.
Public housing has historically failed us. We don't have a say in our lives. And that's the big thing that Aboriginal people hold true to.
And there's no point, you know, arguing with the government now because the horse is bolted. We might as well start, you know, working together and finding ways to, you know, make sure our communities function properly.
For a long time, Aborigines suffered under poorly implemented government policies following the arrival of European settlers. Today, many do not trust the authorities. The current situation is multi-layered and will need time to resolve. But with a high infant mortality rate and a life expectancy 17 years less than the average Australian, time is not on their side.
This week, 101 East comes to you from just outside Parliament in Australia's capital city, Canberra. And joining us to discuss the issue of the future of Aboriginal people in Australia, we're joined by Nicole Watson, Aboriginal lawyer and activist. And we have Pat Anderson, chairperson of the Cooperative Research Centre for Aboriginal Health, and Richard Miles, Member of Parliament with the Labor Party and chairman of the Indigenous Affairs Committee. Thank you very much for joining us. Nicole, if I can just throw the first question to you. We've had the intervention, and the government, despite calls to scrap the intervention or even to amend the intervention, the government says that this policy will continue for another year because there has been success. Have you seen the same success?
No, we haven't. And certainly there has been some very concerning evidence of unintended consequences of the Northern Territory emergency response. The Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, for example, has revealed evidence of instances of starvation and cultural harm. We also have anecdotal evidence of separate shopping queues for Indigenous people who are income managed.
Pat, you were one of the authors of the Little Children Are Sacred report, which started or instigated the Howard government to introduce these emergency measures in the Northern Territory. Were you expecting these measures?
No, not at all. It was a complete shock and I think a betrayal of us all. That report was, you know, the subject matter, as you'll know, is about the sexual abuse and neglect of Aboriginal children. So a very sensitive topic which was handled, I think, very sensitively and very extensively, and the report came out with 94 recommendations, and not one of those recommendations has been picked up or discussed or implemented in any way at all. So it was more than disappointing. However, the Northern Territory did not and does not have the resources, both physical and material, to deal with many of those recommendations. So it did need the federal government to assist them to implement and to negotiate with them how they might make sustainable improvements in the lives of Aboriginal people and those communities.
Richard, why do you think the Rudd government has continued with the same Howard government policies?
Well, the intervention has obviously been a controversial measure, and it's been a difficult measure. We've continued it for the course of this year because all the evidence coming through to us is showing that there is an improvement in what's being bought from stores. There has been a lot of advocacy to us to keep the intervention going. A lot of resources have gone into the Northern Territory as a result of it, but I absolutely acknowledge that there are concerns amongst some in the Indigenous community with it. It's very important that we build trust amongst the Indigenous community. It's very important that what we do going forward takes the Indigenous community with us, and so we need to be developing programs beyond this year which don't involve, for example, the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, and which do have the broad support of the Indigenous community.
Well, a lot of the communities that we've spoken to in the Northern Territory have said a lot of these measures are really just quick fix measures. They don't actually go to the root of the problem. You can limit alcohol, you can control somebody's family income, but what happens then? Well,
certainly we acknowledge that what ultimately needs to be done for Indigenous Australians is something which is going to take many, many years. But there is acute need in remote communities. Indeed, there's acute need throughout the Indigenous community, which does require some immediate action, which is why we've decided to keep the intervention going for 12 months. But in a sense, you're right. The core causes of this in terms of education, in terms of health, are going to require long-term spending over a long period of time, and since the Rudd government's come into power, we've absolutely committed to do that.
Nicole, you've also increased spending in areas that arguably we don't need. And $69 million, for example, of the new money has gone into administering the income management regime that you would concede is racially discriminatory. There was also an underspend in crucial areas like Indigenous health in the last budget, and there was a $200 million underspend in Indigenous health. Indigenous legal aid funding was actually cut in your last budget. How can you justify spending so much money on administration of a racist regime while critical needs are not being met?
Well, whenever you're talking about public policy, everyone immediately points to administration and the costs of it, and the fact of the matter is that in all public policy there is a requirement to engage in administration. But we, in the last budget, committed something in the order of $6 billion Australian dollars towards various measures in Indigenous health, Indigenous education, Indigenous housing, both in the Northern Territory and throughout Australia. This is an unprecedented level of spending on the part of this government, and indeed any federal government, towards trying to address the long-term issues which have affected Indigenous Australians.
And on that point, we're going to have to take a break. After the break, we'll come back and we'll visit a school that's fighting the odds to give Aboriginal children a better chance.